Delighted to see you all here. We're very pleased to have such a significant attendance. I want to thank all of you who are members of the Baker Institute Roundtable. It is your support, as I remind you all and myself constantly, that makes these kinds of events possible for Rice, for Houston, and for Texas. We have an extraordinary speaker today, David Petraeus. I will not dwell overlong on his extraordinary career in military and public service, save only to note he has 4 decades of military service, which included, among many other distinctions, the command of the 101st, the service in Afghanistan as the commander of international forces there, head of MNFI, the multinational force in Iraq, during which time I had the privilege of serving in Baghdad. It was a fraught time for the United States, for our coalition, and for Iraq. But it is a time in which, thanks to the leadership of General Petraeus, we emerged in a situation which had the potential to reset the situation in Iraq for the better, above all for the people of Iraq, but also for enduring United States interests. Now, David has written a book, which is coming out in a second edition fairly shortly, which was entitled Conflict, that goes up to, in his previous edition, to Ukraine. New edition will go up through Gaza. And in our dialogue today, we're going to be exploring the themes of that book, what they mean for conflicts, not past, but present and future. And we certainly look forward to a good discussion on Ukraine, on Gaza, and of course, the situation in Lebanon and northern Israel today. So I want to get to that discussion, then we'll have time for your questions and answers. So please give a welcome to David Petraeus. Take the far chair.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much. If the microphone is on now. It really is a privilege to be here for a number of different reasons. One was you mentioned our service together during what, frankly, for me, was the most important mission in life as we were trying to pull a country out of a terrible Sunni Shia civil war, and successfully did that, drove violence down by 90%. But also your own service. You mentioned kindly, nearly 4 decades for me. Well, you're at 45 years of service and you still are in it, which is just extraordinary. And so when I talk about the Middle East, I'll do it with some trepidation because we have the special envoy here who's been engaged in that over the recent years in particular. It's a privilege to do this at an institute that bears the name of Secretary Baker. I knew him. I observed him from some pretty neat vantage points, one time working for the Chief of Staff of the Army during Panama and the Gulf War, and then later working for the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs. I have enormous respect for him, his skill, his ability not just to motivate people, but also to do really great bureaucratic infighting, which is a skill of its own. Never underestimate the battles of the Potomac. They are every bit as fierce as the battles along the Tigris and the Euphrates, and he did it magnificently. But I think what really distinguished him, and we'll talk about this in a moment, is that as a leader at the very top, in fact, let me start with this, if I could, and I'm sort of launch right into all of this. But I also just want to thank you for the short introduction, mercifully short, because if they give the full introduction, they have to note that I was runner-up for Time Person of the Year in 2007. And people then ask, to whom were you the runner-up? And I have to acknowledge that it was Vladimir Putin.
Different career arcs.
Exactly right. In the book, the one takeaway that we hope readers would emerge from it, among many, but the one we really want them to take, is the critical importance of strategic leadership. This is the leadership of the person at the very top, commanding the surge, the ambassador during the surge. It's the same in a civilian organization. I could do it with Netflix and Reed Hastings, and I do, and I'll do it very quickly at the end. But a strategic leader, unlike all the other leaders who perform the 4 tasks I identify, he's doing it, or she is doing it, at a blank slate in this first task, which is to get the big ideas right. The strategic leader has to craft the right strategy. In conflict, in war, you do it by understanding your forces, the enemy forces, the human terrain, the physical terrain, the neighborhood, all the dynamics that are at play there, and then crafting the right strategy, avoiding what Clausewitz said generals sometimes do, which is to make a war into the one they want to fight rather than what it actually is. You then have to communicate the big ideas, not just through the breadth and depth of the organization you're privileged to lead, but to the citizens of the country in which you're engaged, to your counterparts, to your coalition partners, to the White House, number 10 Downing Street, and above all, to America's mothers and fathers, who I think have a right to know you and what you're trying to do with their sons and daughters on the line. You then have to oversee the implementation of the big ideas. This is what we normally think of as leadership. This is the energy the leader provides, and Secretary Baker was phenomenal at that. The example, again, exemplary, the inspiration, hiring, attracting the best and brightest and hanging on to them as long as you can, developing them, rewarding them, allowing those not measuring up to move on to something else. The organizational architecture that you establish for a particular endeavor, you know, they don't hand that to you. You don't get hit on the head by Newton's apple fully formed very often in life. You have to sort of build it. With the big ideas too. You shape them iteratively, full engagement, openly, transparently, and so on. And then it's the metrics that you use, and it is the way you spend your time. We spent a lot of time figuring out how I would spend my time. What is my battle rhythm? What is the recurring schedule of events, meetings, visits, other activities, as you're driving the execution of the campaign plan that you developed in that first task. And on that battle rhythm, on your schedule, you have events that enable you to perform the fourth task, in some cases force you to do it, because you know that sometimes you need to have an action forcing mechanism. It's 120 degrees out, there's a 30-knot wind blowing sand, and you're sort of tired and you really don't want to make a decision that day. But you've got to force yourself to do that, because if you want to be somewhere 6 or 9 months from now in a huge organization, 180 or 200,000 men and women in uniform in the surge in Iraq, not to mention hundreds of thousands of Iraqis, you got to decide today. So that fourth task is to determine how you need to refine the big ideas, make changes to them, to the strategy as the situation evolves, as you achieve progress or experience setback, whatever it is. You have to constantly be doing that. By the way, if you don't perform this task properly, you end up like Kodak, which was the world leader in film photography and services, had 2,000 patents on digital photography, but failed to make digital photography the new essence of the organization, the new big idea, the strategy, and as a result, they ceased to exist, essentially. So that is the intellectual construct. We lay this out in the introduction. That was one of my contributions to this book, together with the great Lord Roberts of Belgravia, who is a phenomenal historian. This is his 20th book, the first for which he ever had a co-author, and a delight to do this with him. And I'll just note as an aside, among his many, many skills and qualities and so forth, he actually can do something I can't do, which is speak coherently after drinking. I think it's a British quality. Maybe he got it because of his great biography of Churchill, which is acknowledged as the best single-volume biography of the great man. But this construct is the prism through which we examined each of these wars, because what we identified was often the central figure, or the central element that determines success or failure, is the ability of the strategic leader to perform these four tasks, and particularly to get the first one right. In the book, we argue, for example, that it took us 13 years in Vietnam to realize that we should be focusing on security of the people rather than thrashing around in the jungle with huge organizations, killing lots of the enemy, but pursuing a war of attrition that we could not win. And if instead you'd pursued a comprehensive civil military counterinsurgency campaign from the beginning, the enemy has to come to you, you don't go to them, and you would have had much better results. And by the way, the metric that we adopted for a war of attrition, a body count, was the wrong metric as well. That doesn't mean you don't keep track of the enemy you killed. The ambassador will recall every day that I was briefed on among many other topics other metrics, how many bad guys did we kill? But that wasn't the be-all and end-all. The be-all and end-all was driving down the number of attacks, suicide bombings, civilian casualties, and then all that we were doing once you have security to rebuild the country, to reestablish it, and so forth. So that construct is absolutely crucial, and that's the biggest takeaway we hope folks will emerge from having read the book with. And as we go through these conflicts, we'll talk about that, and in particular, about whether or not the strategic leaders have gotten the big ideas right or not. Because even though these military leaders, you know, you go through a pre-commissioning, West Point, you go to a basic course, an advanced course, a staff college full year, war college full year, you'd think that that would be enough to arm us with the intellectual capital to do this right. In many, many cases, that is not the case. The French in Indochina failed. Dien Bien Phu was a horrible big idea. Algeria, they failed. The Brits, on the other hand, did brilliantly in Oman and Malaysia, Falklands. We did it right brilliantly in the Gulf War, and of course, the Secretary was engaged in that. Panama. At Iraq, a much more mixed bag. We carried out the invasion brilliantly, toppled the regime, and then it turned out we turned around to those guys that were supposed to. I remember I asked in Kuwait, can I just get a little more detail on what happens after we get to, I was just a two-star general at the time, Great 101st Airborne Division. When we get to Baghdad and take down the regime, and they say, Dave, you just get us to Baghdad, we'll take it from there. That didn't prove to be particularly adequate. And then when the new leader of the civilian effort came in, his first two actions cut us off at the knees, firing the Iraqi military without telling them how we were going to enable them to provide for themselves and their families, and hundreds of thousands of men with weapons and training who now have an incentive to oppose the new Iraq rather than to support it. That's not good math. And then compounded that by firing the bureaucrats. Yes, they were Ba'ath Party members, but level 4, the bureaucrats we needed to run a country that we didn't sufficiently understand. So again, bad big ideas. It took us years really to recover. In fact, it was not until the ambassador and I were back there for the surge that we actually conducted a true reconciliation campaign to bring them back into the fold and convince them that they had a future that would be better by supporting the new Iraq rather than by opposing it. So again, that's a recurring, this intellectual construct which I developed between my 3- and 4-star tours in Iraq and then employed explicitly as the commander of the surge, later as the commander of U.S. Central Command, the whole greater Middle East, the commander in Afghanistan, CI director, and so on, is the prism through which we'll examine what's going on. And I'll just add, because I said that I wouldn't show you that this is applicable in the civilian world, we'll use Netflix, we're all familiar with it, Reed Hastings, one of the great strategic leaders of our time, right up there with Jack Ma, Alibaba, Jeff Bezos of Amazon, and so forth. So 4 big ideas over the years for Netflix. The first of which is we're going to put movies in the hands of customers without brick and mortar. So we're going to charge less than Blockbuster. Some of us are old enough in this room to remember Blockbuster. You know, it was a little store, you'd go there on a Friday night, you rent a movie, you take it home, you have to return it 2 days later or something like that. Thankfully, there is still one Blockbuster alive in the US. It's in a famously contrarian city called Bend, Oregon. It refuses to allow its Blockbuster to die, and that is awesome because we can take our grandkids there and show them what we did do on a Friday night. Anyway, so that's the first big idea. You know, they work it through all the other tasks and they get down to the bottom and, well, what do we do now? Other companies are doing what we're doing. We have competition. Reed Hastings says, well, the context has changed. Broadband speeds are fast enough now. We can have people download movies. So that's the new big idea. They work through that, expand further. The breakout moment comes when the new big idea is we're going to make our own content. $100 million on House of Cards, incredibly successful series and many others. And that, again, propels them to extraordinary. And of course, they're going global in here. That's another set of big ideas. And then the fourth big idea is we're going to make major motion pictures. And they go out and they buy not 1, but 2 major movie studios. And they do so well, great metric, they got more Academy Award nominations 4 years ago, I think it was, than any other major movie studio. Now, I did sit down with him. I discussed my intellectual construct for strategic leadership, very similar to what he has. And then I said, you know, I do have to comment, Reed, that that movie in which Brad Pitt plays my very close friend, General Stan McChrystal, just does not work. Said Brad Pitt marches around like a little toy soldier. He salutes stiffly. He has no sense of humor. Again, Stan is the opposite of all of that. And I said, besides that, I just couldn't get over the fact that Brad Pitt didn't hold out to play me. So with that up front, David, let's launch into our conversation.
Great. Let's start with the complexities of contemporary warfare. Very few conflicts that rise to the level of international significance, U.S. fundamental strategic interests, are classic state-on-state, army-on-army conflicts. But we do have one.
We do, Ukraine, obviously.
Which is Ukraine.
Yep.
And I want to get your
thoughts. But even
thoughts.
it is different.
Even it is different.
It's very different. It represents the future of warfare in many respects.
More often, we're dealing with non-state actors or
Yes.
combinations
Yep.
of state actors,
Right.
Iran, non-state
Yep.
actors, Hamas, Hezbollah,
Yep.
other radical groups, Al-Qaeda and ISIS back in the day
Yes.
in
Yep.
Iraq.
Yep.
But there is a theme that links all of this, or rather a concept which links all of it, which I'd like your thoughts on, and it's escalation dominance.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is what Israel is trying to re-achieve with respect to Hezbollah right now. Keep in mind that the Hezbollah, out of sympathy with Hamas, has been launching volleys of rockets into northern Israel every day, sometimes many of them, sometimes modest number. And generally have limited it. Again, I'm telling the man who was out there negotiating, or trying to negotiate. And the Israelis had lost escalation dominance, or at least that quality of deterrence, to prevent them from doing this. And by the way, they're setting about achieving that right now. What caused the displacement of 80,000 Israelis from their homes for approaching a year now. And at some point, that was not tolerable. As the ambassador knows, he's part of it. We've had very extensive negotiations led by a very talented diplomat, Amos Hochstein, who's been back and forth between Beirut and Israel and other locations, trying to convince Hezbollah to stop this, to decouple, if you will, from Hamas, and also to move north of the Litani River, which would push them about roughly 10 miles, give or take, from the northern Israeli border, and it pushes them out of range of the most ubiquitous rockets, the 122 millimeter rockets, which we contended with big way in the spring of 2008, the second year when the Iranians supported.
Yes.
Actually, it started in March, and we called it the real March Madness, and it really was, but we eventually destroyed them. So Israel is setting out to degrade very significantly the capabilities of Hezbollah. They have been doing this. They've been taking out leaders very precisely. They've been going after specific capabilities, headquarters, launch pads, storage sites. And then they unleashed the most diabolically creative and clever and well-executed supply chain operation, I think, in history, where thousands of pagers clearly had been altered with explosives and an ignition sequence installed on it. And of course, the pagers were being handed out to the most important Hezbollah leaders because the leader of Hezbollah had said, we can't use cell phones anymore. The Israelis are onto that, and they can track us, and they use this to target us. So they switched over to these pagers, and simultaneously, of course, thousands of them exploded, and the devastating impact on the Hezbollah leadership, and also then on their preferred method of command and control, which they thought was safe and was not. They then shifted to their walkie-talkies, basically, and it turns out that those started blowing up the next day as well. So really an extraordinary development at that time. Then, more recently, they've gone after hundreds of targets of Hezbollah and have had quite a devastating impact. The key, obviously, in doing this is to be absolutely as precise as possible, minimize civilian casualties, minimize damage to civilian infrastructure, and so forth. And I think in this case, I think they are doing that. It's always difficult, and I'm always a bit reluctant to second guess those who are in the field who actually have the targeting information and the whole precision of what it is, the engineering of this, having been second guessed to death by people back in Washington in particular during 5 general officer combat commands. But that's what they're seeking to do. And it may be that they have to, at the end of the day, also conduct a limited ground operation to push Hezbollah north to the Litani River an area in which the Hezbollah is not supposed to be, according to a UN Security Council resolution, and where a UN peacekeeping force has proved remarkably ineffective at keeping them out of it. The problem with that is that if you're going to ensure that, you may have to occupy that area, and we'll see how that works out. May have to fortify it to keep them out of it. But I agree with this. Look, you cannot have a non-state force that is supported by the enemy of most of the region, Iran, carrying out this kind of indiscriminate rocket fire that has displaced 80,000 people and kept them in that limbo situation for many, many months. Let me digress really quickly here, though, and mention when I was the commander of U.S. Central Command, again, the greater Middle East, Pakistan in the west, Egypt in the east, Kazakhstan in the north, Yemen in the pirate-infested waters off the south, 2 wars, Iran and Iraq, Iraq and Afghanistan, and then 2 half wars, Yemen and the pirates. During that time, we had 3 truths that we distilled. And I said, we got to really internalize these. The first of these is, in the Middle East, never confuse your enemies and your friends. Be very clear who they are. Iran is our enemy. They have sworn to destroy Israel and to destroy the U.S. presence in the region. And Israel and the Gulf states, regardless of the friction that we may have at the top at any given time and disagreements and so forth, they are our partners, our friends, and our allies. The second is that Las Vegas rules do not apply in the Middle East. What happens there doesn't stay there. Rather, it tends to spew violence, instability, extremism, and in many cases, tsunamis of refugees, not just in neighboring countries, but all the way into the countries of our most important NATO allies. And the impact of that on domestic politics in many of those European countries has been really very profound. It's the source of the rise of these right-wing movements in some of these countries. The third is, and I know the ambassador appreciates this because he and I have both repeatedly been sort of frustrated by the endless desire of administrations of either party to get out of the Middle East. Now look, I understand we should try to reduce the force to the greatest extent that we can. The priority has to be the most important theater of the world, which is the Indo-Pacific, and the most important relationship in the world, which is that between the US and the West and China. And we want to make sure there that severe competition, which is how the relationship is described by our National Security Advisor, never erupts into actual confrontation. And I embrace that. That's the priority. That's the main effort. But for a country like the United States, you don't just keep one plate spinning. You got to keep a lot of plates spinning simultaneously. And continued engagement in the Middle East is one of those. And so I think the truth here, as we distilled it, is that the U.S. trying to leave the Middle East is a little bit like Michael Corleone trying to leave the mafia. You just keep getting sucked back in. And we should just recognize that we should have an enduring presence, again, as efficient and modest as is possible, but don't continually unsettle our allies and partners out there by making them think that we're about to decamp and leave them to themselves.
David, Lebanon presents right now a potentially credible and rational big picture strategic plan. It's not to destroy Hezbollah. It's not to occupy all of Lebanon, destroy all the launchers. It is to get a very specific geographic and battlefield outcome. End the rocketing, decouple from Hamas, and move back out of ATGM range.
Anti-tank guided missile and rocket range.
To the Litani. Potentially doable, not guaranteed, but it's a concept.
I agree with this, by the way, and I don't visit Israel anywhere near as much as you do, but I've spent time on the ground. I also appreciate what I'm not sure all in the United States appreciate, and that is the trauma that Israel experienced. Not just the fact that this is the worst intelligence and military readiness and political failure in their history, but it's the worst day in their history. Remember, we lost not quite 3,000 civilians, innocent civilians, in the 9/11 attacks. The equivalent of what Israel experienced and sustained would be us losing 40,000 killed and 7,000 taken hostage, and you have to keep that in mind. Particularly as sometimes people get a bit frustrated with what Israel is doing. That doesn't mean that you accept everything that they are doing or want to do. I think it's well and good to occasionally see things through a different prism. But it does mean you do need to understand that. And again, I'm very much with you that this is something that was forced on Israel because of Hezbollah's actions, probably encouraged by Iran, to show sympathy for Hamas by carrying out repeated rocket and anti-tank guided missiles. They actually just take them and use them as indirect fire.
Right. But let's move from that concept to Gaza,
Sure.
which presents an absolutely unique circumstance. We had a conversation with the Prime Minister, with Netanyahu, in which he rhetorically asked us, he said, what military campaign has been like this? Below ground, above ground, hostages. And he said, I asked my experts.
It's unprecedented.
But he said the closest they could say, Manila, MacArthur. MacArthur knew and loved Manila, and he didn't want to use aerial bombardment. Thousands of Allied POWs in the drainage and sewer and water tunnels under the city, and MacArthur decided to go in by ground. And rhetorically asked, and what was the casualty count?
Enormous.
110,000, 10% of the population of Manila.
Yep.
These are hard campaigns to fight.
This is the most diabolically difficult context, I think, certainly in modern times. This is Fallujah, Ramadi, Baquba, Mosul, and Baghdad all in one, and even much more difficult.
Without the time and space to move populations, which we have.
Exactly. And without unlimited resources, 300 and some odd miles of tunnel underground, which make this very, very challenging.
So I'm not going to volunteer this, but I'm going to ask you, tell me how Gaza ends.
Well, I taught economics in an earlier life. I still teach. I'm the Kissinger Fellow at Yale right now, and I lead a seminar, graduate seminar on great power competition every spring. But as an economics professor, I learned that the answer to every question should begin with the words, it depends. And it does depend. The big ideas that Prime Minister Netanyahu has announced, if you will, sort of the war aims, to destroy Hamas, to keep Hamas from ever governing Gaza again, and to get the hostages back, noting that the first two were in serious tension with the third one. I agree with those objectives. I don't fully agree with how they're going about achieving those. And I've had this conversation with the Minister of Defense. What they're doing might be described in military terms similar to what we were doing prior to the surge in Iraq, which is you conduct clear and leave operations, not clear, hold, and build. And if you clear and leave or raid and leave or just do a lot of damage, now to be fair, they have degraded Hamas dramatically. And because they control the southern border underneath which the tunnels used to run, they can prevent Hamas from being reconstituted in terms of the military capabilities that they used to have, which were very considerable. And they have degraded that considerably. But if you just go in and come back out, who is actually running Gaza? Well, it's actually remnants of Hamas. It's remnants of the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, one of their kindred spirits, and it's criminal elements. And unless you actually achieve security, nothing else is possible. I believe there should be a vision for the future of the Palestinian people that is similar to the vision that we presented to the people of Iraq before we conducted the major operations that we did there during the surge. Remember, this was in a period where Al-Qaeda in Iraq was throughout the Sunni areas, and you had Iranian-supported Shia militia in the Shia areas, and of course they were fighting at all of the different, so a terrible Sunni-Shia civil war. The way out of this is to provide a vision, and we would go to the people of Fallujah, and we would tell them in advance of our operation, we are going to make your lives better. We're going to do it by getting Al-Qaeda out of your neighborhoods, and then we're going to stay in those neighborhoods. We're going to create gated communities, essentially. It's an accurate description, but with much more effective walls. In fact, we would tell them, I said, look, it costs a lot of money to be in a gated community in Florida, and we're going to give it to you for free here in Fallujah. But I think Fallujah, we did something like 12 gated communities. You clear them completely. Every building, floor, room, cellar, and in Gaza it includes vast tunnel complexes and subterranean infrastructure. We then create these, again, gated communities. You then begin the organized provision of humanitarian assistance. And because you have security now, you can use non-governmental organizations to do it, contractors. If you do this in Gaza, You can introduce Palestinian security forces that would be trustworthy and be trained and equipped perhaps at the Jordan International Police Training Center that we've used over the years for a variety of different forces. So the Israeli response is, well, we don't have the size force that's required for clear hold and build, such as you did during the surge in Iraq, and they're right. So you'd have to do it incrementally. But there's a famous saying from Vietnam by one of the iconic figures of that war, John Paul Vann, who said security may be 10% of the problem or 90% of the problem. Regardless, it's the first 10% or the first 90%. You have to achieve security. And right now, despite requests from the IDF Chief of Staff, the Israeli Defense Force Chief of Staff, and the Minister of Defense for such a vision, it has not been forthcoming. My proposal would be to tell the Palestinian people, we're going to make your lives better by getting Hamas out of your lives, and also Palestinian Islamic Jihad, there's some others. The way we're going to do this is we're going to come from the north, we're going to go a mile into the territory, put an east-west wall, do it in a single night. We used to put walls up in many locations that length every single night. Put a couple north-south walls, you have 3 or 4 gated communities, you painstakingly clear them, you give the residents biometric ID cards. By the way, in the process of doing that, you can identify many of the Hamas remnants because they conveniently uploaded their images after conducting truly barbaric and horrific actions on 10/7, and then repeat the process. You cut entry control points in, you control those very carefully, you cut them in from Israel as well. Now, again, organized humanitarian assistance for the first time. It's not organized right now. It's organized until it enters, and then there's a pistol put to their head and they get out of the truck and somebody takes it in many of the cases. And then you can get NGOs in, you can get international organizations, you can start to begin to introduce trusted Palestinian security forces, you can use contractors. Again, all to help augment the Israeli forces who are in short supply so that they can thin out and then do it again, rinse and repeat. And you just keep doing this. Yes, when you get to Gaza City, over 1 million people, densely populated, you're gonna have to slice that up in different ways. But this is, in my view, the only way that you can actually achieve security, provide a better life to the Palestinian people, and show a path to a better future that would include, over time, the Israelis thinning out more and more and more, and again, trusted Palestinian security forces administering and securing and governing their areas. There's nothing easy about this. There was nothing easy about the surge. This is even much more difficult given the circumstances and the challenges, but I just don't see an alternative. And without that, they're doomed. They're destined to a life what is essentially a very densely packed refugee camp with most of the buildings destroyed and so forth. I'm sure you've either been in there or seen the images of the level of the destruction.
And David, the things we focused on in Iraq, before, but especially with and after the surge, a humanitarian plan.
Yes, yeah.
Which has been wholly lacking,
yes.
Despite our declaration, the President's declaration back on October 18. Mm-hmm. You got to conduct a kinetic campaign. It's going to take you time and space to do. It's going to be hard, but we'll be with you. But you got to have a humanitarian campaign that enables and sustains the support, the space you need for that. That's never been adequate. The second aspect is that political horizon, the vision.
Yes.
You got to offer something that counters Hamas's appeal to an increasingly desperate population.
Exactly right.
Can't do it without that.
No, exactly right. Couldn't agree more. And again, I understand the reservations about Israel reoccupying. This wouldn't include settlements or any of that stuff. This is really just to achieve security, provide opportunities for transition over time to legitimate Palestinian security forces and governance that will not have as their core objective the destruction of Israel. Now, eventually, again, you even should revive the two-state concept.
Absolutely.
There's no alternative to it. I understand all the obstacles that have been created by settlements and other challenges and the undermining of the institutions.
You have to
start with a vision.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it starts with a big idea.
Let's go to Ukraine.
Let's do
where
that.
You've just been.
I have, yep.
Let's talk about escalation dominance, response, both the disaster of Russian military preparedness and strategy, what Ukraine has done, and what should be done now?
Yep. So again, this is my fourth trip in the last, I think, 16 or 17 months. And then, of all things, on Sunday night, I presented President Zelensky the Academy of Achievement Golden Plate Award. This is one of these organizations that recognizes excellence. I was privileged to be recognized in 2012. And it was a huge honor, but it gave us another chance to talk privately about this and about his peace for plan that he's going to lay out for President Biden. The Russians launched this war thinking that they would roll right over the Ukrainians, thinking that it would be a short operation. I'm sure that Vladimir Putin told President Xi in China when they met before the Olympics in Beijing, I just got this little special operation, no big deal, don't worry about it, it can be easy. We're gonna just, they don't really exist as a separate nation, they shouldn't. They should be part of Russia. And so we're just gonna reestablish that. And obviously that turned out to be seriously flawed. I mean, his big ideas were really flawed. On the other hand, by the way, you have President Zelensky, who, of course, keep in mind that this is an individual who is an actor. He was a comedian who played the president so effectively in a TV series that he got elected president. And in his 2.25 years prior, as the president, prior to this latest Russian invasion, had really only modest success carrying out the reforms he was elected to implement. And then the war begins, and he becomes positively Churchillian. In fact, Churchill with an iPhone. His first big idea is, I don't want to ride, I want ammunition. I'm staying in Kyiv. My family's going to stay in Kyiv. We're going to fight for Kyiv. We're not going to surrender our country. And they do so with such extraordinary skill, initiative, innovativeness, individual intrepid actions, and so on, that Russia actually has to withdraw both axes that were aimed at Kyiv and then many of the others as well. Unfortunately, they did manage to take more territory in the southeast and south, and that has been very problematic. And over time, the context is against Ukraine. Russia is a country, it's a gas station with guns. It's got a very considerable economic advantage, 10 to 15 to 1 over Ukraine. The manpower advantage probably somewhere in the 4 or 5 to 1 range, and they're recruiting very actively. They're throwing money at the problem. And so it's tough for Ukraine. Ukraine has offset many of these disadvantages by the quality of their soldiers, their leaders, their thinking, their concepts. I mean, this is a country that now has an Army, Navy, Air Force, and drone force, the first one in the world. It's creating new drone battalions about every few months. I visited a drone battalion. I've never seen a drone battalion before. We had lots of drones, but nothing on the scale of this at all. They're producing 1 million drones, very cheap compared to our systems that are exquisite, but not even much more effective than what they have. Very effective, and constantly iterating. The partnership between the military organizations and the manufacturers is like this, which we don't have either here. So these unmanned systems that they have used have offset some of the Russian advantages. In particular, how does a country that has no meaningful navy, surface combatants, destroy 1/3 of the Black Sea Fleet? Drones, air drones that find them, and maritime drones that they made that then sink them, and have forced the Russians to withdraw from the Western Black Sea, including the centuries-old port of Sevastopol. The final ship had to be pulled from that in Crimea. But again, the war goes on. They've actually used drones on the front lines, throwing thousands of them at the Russians every single day. This is the most perilous battlefield, I think, in history. There are essentially no man's lands between the front lines of the Russians and the front lines of the Ukrainians. And you set foot into that, and there's a drone over top that will take action pretty quickly against you. They're just loitering suicide drones. And then there are others that can drop various types of munitions. They can drop it through the hatch of a tank or hit into a vehicle and all the rest. There's also drone-on-drone warfare now, so you're having dogfights among unmanned systems. But it really is a more than a hint of warfare of the future. But again, the reality is that Ukraine is heavily outnumbered, it is heavily outgunned, and it is really quite fraught right now. The Russians have carried out a really barbaric campaign of attacks with missiles and drones against Ukrainian infrastructure, including the largest children's hospital in Kyiv, another hospital in another location. They have systematically targeted the Ukrainian electrical generation and transmission infrastructure. Every single hydroelectric plant in Ukraine has been struck, not all destroyed, but many have. And they're going to have a long, cold, dark winter, I'm afraid. How does this end? Remember I asked that question, and forgetting that my embedded journalist, I was not off the record, as I was seeing the assumptions that we were given before the invasion of Iraq being validated one after the other. And boy, did I ever hear it tell me how this ends again and again and again in congressional hearings. But in this case, I think the way it ends is if we do what Volodymyr Zelensky is going to ask the president to do, which is to provide more assistance more rapidly, reduce the restrictions on the use of our most capable munitions on Russian territory, with which I strongly agree, and change the dynamic. And by changing the dynamic, what I mean is that you get Putin finally to recognize that he cannot achieve additional gains at an acceptable cost. And then and only then, the idea that he's serious about negotiations is nonsense. He's just throwing sand in the gears of international relations and trying to get countries to pressure President Zelensky to go to the negotiating table and give up his country. Now, he may have to give up terrain and territory. The people in Ukraine this time, more than any other time previously, it's quite clear, are developing war weariness. The privations, especially if you're on a fixed income or retiree, inflation there is very significant. The normal services aren't working the way that they used to. You know, when the electricity goes off, the elevator goes off, the water goes off, the subway doesn't run. All of this is, again, very, very challenging for the population. And the only way to get the guns to fall silent, in my view, is again to convince Putin to stop the war because it's no longer in his interest to continue it. You've got to help them do that more effectively, and then if they're going to negotiate and give up terrain, we're going to have to provide them an ironclad security guarantee to ensure that Putin never thinks about going farther beyond the point that they are at right now.
David.
By the way, if I could just very quickly, because there are people in reasonably responsible positions who argue that we can't afford to do Ukraine. Of course, we're not fighting and dying there. We're just helping another country fight for its independence and very right to exist against a common enemy, the most serious threat in the European continent. We can't do that and the Middle East and the Indo-Pacific simultaneously. My argument is if you don't help Ukraine, you will undermine deterrence out of the Indo-Pacific because deterrence rests on two elements: the potential adversary's assessment of your capabilities on the one hand and your willingness to employ them on the other. And if you're not willing to help Ukraine in its fight for its independence, where we're not losing any of our men and women in uniform, then why would they think that you're going to fight out in the Pacific if China perhaps makes a muscular move to try to reunify with Taiwan? I think deterrence there rests on us meeting what I think are the cold, hard, realistic interests that we should be pursuing relative to Russia and also, frankly, in the Middle East.
Mm-hmm. David, you were Director of Central Intelligence.
Don't ask me about Area 58. There are no extraterrestrials, please, believe me.
Oh, they're us. The question I have for you is, you understand very well, I do as well, not everything in intelligence estimates or analysis is cut and dried. There are levels of certainty
Absolutely.
and uncertainty,
Yep.
low confidence,
Yep.
medium confidence, high. There are
Yep.
terms of art.
Yep.
The concern over escalation, and this is a
great
phenomenon
question. Yep.
with regard to Russia
Will
and
Russia- yep.
Iran.
Will-
And Iran.
Yep, true.
How do you deal with this, the uncertainty?
Well, I mean, first of all, you try to gather every single bit of information you can. You, as I used to say, you marinate in all the information. You try to understand it. You consult the experts. You know, you don't want the least common denominator of a bunch of average people. You want the very best to give you their advice. And over time, of course, you develop real confidence in certain individuals. By the way successive presidents did in the man whose name is on this institute. In the case of Ukraine, I think we have overblown the risks of escalation. Not that you shouldn't be concerned about that, particularly up until President Xi of China, biggest partner with Putin, partnership with no limits, supposedly there have been. And then Prime Minister Modi in India, who's a big customer of Russian oil and also still gets, there's a lot of Russian legacy military systems for which they need spare parts, et cetera. Both of these leaders told Putin publicly, don't even think about using nuclear weapons. And I think it would be insane for him to do that. And I don't think he is insane. And the idea that he's backed into a corner, no way like that. And by the way, it doesn't actually achieve all that much. On the battlefield, tactical nuclear weapons have a tactical outcome. And by the way, the prevailing winds means that it probably blows, the radioactive waste blows over the Russians, not over the Ukrainians. So again, I tend to discount that. I've had a lot of questions about, won't he do more? What more could he do? He's launching glide bombs, 50 kilometers with, there's a GPS in them, but they're just so big, 6,000 pounds, that the damage is pretty indiscriminate. They're carrying out these human wave attacks. They're buying millions of rounds from North Korea, drones and missiles from Iran. I mean, what more could he do? He's trying to do everything already, and I just don't see what the concern is there about escalation. Now, you and I both know it's a lot easier to sit on this stage right here and sort of second guess those who are sitting in a chair in the real Situation Room, not Wolf Blitzers, but the one in the West Wing of the White House. And you feel that responsibility. When you're at a principals committee meeting there with, say, the National Security Advisor or an actual NSC meeting with the president and the chair, you're really conscious. And there's a tendency, I think, rightly, to be a bit conservative and cautious. But I think we've been overly conservative and overly cautious.
And Iran, and I'll call an anecdote to mind.
Yep.
Iranian surrogates, Lebanese Hezbollah, the IRGC, were killing our troops, coalition troops, Iraqi troops, mercilessly.
Yep.
And
with these very, very, very lethal, they were called
car bombs.
EFPs, really, is what it was. It was an explosively formed penetrator. They were so carefully milled that they would slice right through the armor of an M1 tank. Right. Very, very lethal.
We were concerned.
Yep.
You will recall.
Yep.
If we countered this by aggressive action, Iran could escalate in a more damaging fashion than we could. Then by accident, we wrapped up a group of IRGC facilitators up in the north.
Yep.
And Iran froze in place for almost 3 months.
Yep.
Well, that was a lesson learned, but I'm not sure that it isn't a lesson that needs to be learned periodically.
I think it does, actually. I think we were a bit hesitant, frankly, at times. In fact, you'll remember the outcome of that is that we were forced to release those individuals.
I do indeed.
Which was not helpful. But we made up for it because we stumbled into some others, as you may recall.
Yes.
Including an individual who was the number 2 in the organization in the Iranian Revolutionary Guards Corps Quds Force. He was actually Lebanese Hezbollah, but he was on detail, who was training Arab forces. And we didn't know who we had for quite a while because he refused to speak. We called him Hamid the Mute for quite a period of time. And he would write, and he said, I will begin talking on 1 May Day. And he started talking, and gosh, I think he'd still be talking if we'd hung on to him. And it was very helpful to us to understand the infrastructure that was in place inside Iraq. Iran has long sought to what we might describe as Lebanonize Iraq. In other words, to create the same conditions that they've been able to establish in Lebanon, where you have this very powerful muscle on the street, Hezbollah, and you have quite powerful bloc in the parliament. They can prevent anything they don't like. And that's a pretty advantageous position for them. They'd like to create this in Baghdad. They have elements of it, but it's not the kind of coherent Shia militias. There are a number of different Shia militias. They're all problematic. And then the political grip is, again, there are Shia who actually push back against the Iranian-supported Shia, and then you also have a Sunni and a Kurdish population as well. But no, I think you're right. And I also think, by the way, that the Iranians are not going to take the final step to enrich to weapons-grade uranium because they know that we will destroy the Iran nuclear program if they do that.
And they believe we would find out.
Yes, they do, and that's crucial. And as a, again, former director of the CIA, I'm pretty confident we would figure that out. We have, as they say in the business, very good insights into what is being done in Iran, as do our, again, Israeli partners. In fact, it's publicly known that when I was the commander of U.S. Central Command, we developed the plan to destroy the Iran nuclear program. And we actually rehearsed it one time inside the continental United States, flying we had to do laps around the continent many times for some of the aircraft with this huge air refueling bridge up, and we dropped all the munitions that we would drop. We showed that we could do what we needed to do. And that plan is still very much in place. It's more difficult now because the Iranians have some improvements to their air and ballistic missile defenses, although the Israelis penetrated right through them.
S-300.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, but I think, touch wood, that they will not take that final step, because if they do, we'll be compelled to destroy that program. And if we don't, Israel will try to, but there are limits to what they have. It's publicly known that one of the targets requires what's called the massive ordnance penetrator. This is a massive bomb, about 20,000 pounds, and it's actually quite precise. The Israelis don't have that bomb, nor do they even have a plane that could carry it and deliver it. We do, and so that would have to be an integral component of this. I hope that deterrence works at that level, even though deterrence hasn't worked in a number of other Iranian activities in the region.
Exactly. David, one more question for me,
Yep.
and it's sort of a fundamental one. It's something you were heavily involved in. We're going to have HR coming here, I hope, in coming months.
H.R. McMaster?
Yes, to talk as well.
A great individual, brilliant, and one who would never leave something left unsaid, which is why I had to go back and be the president of the Brigadier General Board, or he'd be a retired colonel right
I
now.
recall well.
In the middle of combat, by the way. I mean, never before has a commander in the field in a major, we're still in the first 8 months of the surge.
One-star promotion.
Yep, it was key. Otherwise, we would have been deprived of the brilliance and the welcome. I welcomed the outspoken nature but not all did, as you know.
The question is counterinsurgency.
Yes, please.
You've written in the book, and we've talked often, you've talked outside that book, on the elements needed for a successful counterinsurgency strategy. And some of those elements, public understanding and acceptance, political support, which means your domestic political system has got to be in it in terms of time, financing, and what I would call strategic patience. Well, Vladimir Putin would be the first to label us as strategically impatient. We want it now, and we are intolerant of shades of gray. How do you conduct, in a modern battlefield, in a modern situation, a counterinsurgency campaign with the current set that we and our allies as well have, that is impatient rather than patient?
Well, first of all, you hope that the commander-in-chief is President George W. Bush, because when he launched the surge, this is very unpopular. The Joint Chiefs were not enthusiastic. One of them said, "Sir, I think it might break my service." The president said, "General, I'll tell you what will break the service, that is losing a war." He put in a new commander, a new ambassador. He committed additional forces instead of withdrawing. All the major advisors to him were advising against
Condi
this.
and I, Truth in Lending, strongly opposed
Well,
the
again,
surge.
in part, I think because there was not a full understanding of what might be possible if we actually change the big ideas. So keep in mind, you could not have just continued to do what we were doing and achieve progress, even with extra forces. We were clearing and leaving. We were handing off to Iraqi security forces responsibility for security, but as the violence of the civil war escalated, they could no longer handle it. They got beaten up very badly. Many of them were intimidated, and so there was a reluctance to do so, but I said, we have to go back downtown. We have to live with the people to secure them, and that's the only approach. In fact, I had a series of big ideas, if you will, and I promulgated these in a counterinsurgency guidance that I put out personally. It was a series of admonitions. Secure and serve the people. We can only do this by living with them. We're going back downtown. There's enough of this consolidated on big bases. And that's a big decision because they're going to fight us in every one of these. So we created 77 additional joint security stations, combat outpost bases, and so forth. And you'd have to be in there. You'd go in at last light. You have to have a wall up around it, whatever that base is going to be, very quickly, because they're going to run suicide car bombs at you in the morning. And then it was promote reconciliation. We cannot kill or capture our way out of an industrial strength insurgency. We have to reconcile with as many of the rank and file of the Sunni insurgent group and the Shia militia. You can't. Al-Qaeda was irreconcilable, as is Hamas, by the way, I believe. Third was pursue the irreconcilables even more relentlessly than we have, create even more civil military integration. And it went on down through this. I mean, we had one for dealing with the press. It was called Be First with the Truth. What a concept. No spin, no lipstick on pigs. We're going to go to a podium and say, this is what happened to the best of our knowledge. This is what we should have learned from it. This is what we're going to do in the future to mitigate the risk of the disaster that just took place. There was another one. I mean, there was one that said walk. Another one that said take off your sunglasses. And then there was one, because this is a small unit war, it said promote initiative. In the absence of orders, figure out what they should have been and execute aggressively. So you're going to sort of have fun with this kind of thing. But again, you have to put that across. Now, the other, David, is the commander has to be accessible. I was criticized at times or questioned, I was labeled a celebrity general. That was not a term of endearment, especially with the Obama administration, because it was seen as challenging, perhaps. There's room inside the Beltway for one superstar, and it's not going to be you. That's what I was told, by the way. So I said, is CIA close enough to the Beltway? So you've got to be out there. I realized I had to be the face of the war. Everybody else had been discredited by that point in time until we regained confidence, until Secretary Gates is fully in the saddle. He became a great spokesman, Admiral Mullen, but he wasn't the chairman for the first 8 or 9 months. So you have to explain to the American people and other people, the Iraqi people, you have to lay out the vision. You have to then lay out how you're going to achieve that vision, and then you got to start producing results. I really did believe we could do in Iraq what we did. I was not 100% confident we could do it in time for my appearance at a 6-month testimony that I had agreed to do under duress during the confirmation process. And that was staring me in the face. And I said it's going to get worse before it gets better, and it does. You go back into these neighborhoods and you take back control from Al-Qaeda or the Shia militia supported by Iran, they're going to fight you for it. And we're creating these gated communities, biometric ID cards. This stuff takes time. Thankfully, 8 of the final 11 weeks before that 6-month testimony, some of you may remember, this is incredibly emotional. The New York Times published a full-page center ad against me, personally called me General Petraeus, and all the rest of this stuff. MoveOn.org got a cut rate on that. So this is pretty tumultuous, but we had decent initial results, and from there on out, it just kept building, and we eventually drove violence down, as I said earlier, by nearly 90%. By the way, we showed the metrics at the first 6-month hearing, explained the methodology, how granular they were, the rigor of gathering the information, and I said, I'm going to stand by these for the rest of the time that I'm privileged to be in command, and thankfully that came out. But you have to provide a path, and I think we were able to do that at that moment for the first time in the war, because the war had not gone the way we had hoped it would. There was a terrible event about a year before the surge started in which an Al-Qaeda, so a Sunni extremist, bombed a Shia sacred shrine that was in an area secured by Sunnis. And this had a devastating effect. It set off a cycle of sectarian violence that was terrifying. And that's really what invalidated the previous strategy. And then it took far too long to acknowledge that and to realize that we have to do something different. Okay. So instead of clear and leave or just handing off to the Iraqi security forces, we have to go back and retake it. We have to rebuild the Iraqi security forces. And then and only then can we begin to thin out. But we did. And then the beauty, the real achievement was that over the subsequent 3.5 years of drawdown, the level of violence continued to go down. Unfortunately, right as our last combat forces were withdrawn, the Prime Minister of Iraq, our friend Nouri al-Maliki, took highly sectarian actions within 24 hours that inflamed the Sunni population, led the security forces to take their eye off Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which by then was the Islamic State, allowed them to reconstitute. This is why you can't allow Hamas to reconstitute. And within a couple of years, you had the first ever Islamist extremist caliphate in northern Iraq and northeastern Syria.
And the president decided.
And he decided to go back in.
He did not want to stay.
Yes, we could have. There were ways that we could have done it. I got it. There was no status of forces agreement signed by the parliament. The irony is that we put 5,500 troops back on Iraqi soil without a status of forces agreement.
It was my status of forces agreement.
Yeah, right.
And it could have been continued with a 3-sentence note.
Mm-hmm.
If we wanted it.
Yep, exactly. And both of us made that point, but at least we made the point.
Now, David, we've dealt with many of the questions our
Yep.
audience has raised,
Okay.
but I got two for you.
Good.
In your opinion, what is the single greatest threat, existential threat, that the U.S. faces today?
I think all things China is a pretty good approach. Again, it's the only real other superpower out there. There is a difference, obviously, of very significant difference of opinion when it comes to Taiwan. There's quite aggressive action in the East and South China Seas. Of course, this is very different from the Cold War. A lot of people say we're in a new Cold War 2.0. Certainly there are elements that are very similar, but there's one area in which is completely dissimilar, and that's the level of trade and economic exchange between the US and the Western world and China. The fact is that back in the days of the original Cold War, we had very, very little economic action with the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact. That is completely different in this case. But recognize that it's not just that we are heavily dependent on goods and services produced by China. They can't feed their people or their livestock without what we export to them. So it goes both ways. Should we de-risk? Yes, but we cannot decouple. But it is, I think, all China all the time. That's the most important, the biggest, most important big idea is to have a comprehensive, integrated whole of governments with an S on the end approach to China, so all of our allies and partners together. And we've made some good gains in recent years in restoring some of the important alliances, particularly the one with the Philippines. But I think at the end of the day, that is the one that deserves to be. So if you think of, again, the US as the guy in the circus keeping a lot of plates spinning simultaneously, with help from our friends and allies, and the plates represent threats, challenges, et cetera. And I think there's more of those in that tent now than at any time since the end of the Cold War. There's a China plate. That plate is bigger than all the other plates put together, and we've got to do everything we can to make sure it doesn't wobble, in particular by ensuring that the elements of deterrence that I described earlier are rock solid.
Last question, and a very tough one.
Sure.
Afghanistan.
Yep.
Was what we were trying to do in Afghanistan, which amounted to the remaking of a country on a model it had never experienced, a bridge too far? Was the stoplight chart always going to be on red?
Well, we probably were overly ambitious. That doesn't mean that the achievements there weren't very considerable. The problem was that we got impatient, even though we should not have. In the book, I note Vietnam was unsustainable. The cost in blood and treasure at the end and the loss of public opinion, massive demonstrations, the country's coming apart. We had to get out of Vietnam. We didn't have to get out of Afghanistan. I mean, we had 2,500 troops on the ground, maybe 3,500 depending on your counting rules. That was very sustainable. We hadn't lost a soldier in 18 months until the tragic bombing at Abbey Gate during that chaotic withdrawal. So the cost in blood, what is the determination of sustainability? It's the cost in blood and treasure. We hadn't lost a soldier. Afghans have been fighting hard and dying, but that's their country. They did need our support. But there is no reason we could not have sustained that effort. Yes, it was frustrating. There was erosion of security that was unsettling. Our allies and partners on the ground, our counterparts, were maddening in many cases. There was corruption. But that was so much better than what we see in Afghanistan now. You see the reimposition of an 8th or 9th century interpretation of ultra-conservative Islam. You see now not just women who are incredibly restricted. I mean, you can do virtually nothing outside the house without a male guardian, no meaningful participation in the economy. You're losing 50% of the population. And now the men all have to grow fist-length beards. They can't look at other women. They can't dress like Westerners. I mean, again, that's not the be-all and end-all in life, but when you prevent half of the population from even attending high school, you are just setting this country back. They've lost the talent. People are voting with their feet. And again, the deprivation, the collapse of the economy, starvation, and so forth are all horrific. And, of course, Islamist extremists are back in the shadow of the Hindu Kush. And it was the Islamic State Khorasan group, sort of a cousin of the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria or al-Sham. They carried out the attack in the Moscow Opera House that killed over 150 Russians. So they're stretching their legs now, and this should be worrisome, because remember, the reason we went to Afghanistan in the first place is because al-Qaeda had a sanctuary in Afghanistan in which they planned the 9/11 attacks and conducted the initial training of the attackers under the Taliban regime, which refused to eliminate them or turn them over to us. So we had to go in. You got to topple the Taliban and eliminate that sanctuary. When I went to command Afghanistan, I said, we're not going to be able to achieve here what we did during the surge in Iraq. The conditions are very different. In fact, when I was a 3-star, coming home from my 3-star tour in Iraq, Secretary Rumsfeld asked me to go through Afghanistan, do an assessment. And the first slide in that briefing to him was, Afghanistan does not equal Iraq. And I compared and contrasted, and Afghanistan was much more difficult in every regard. Had no money, had no infrastructure. The enemy had massive sanctuaries in the neighboring country that refused to do anything about it or allow us to do much about it. You're in the Hindu Kush, real serious terrain, all the rest of this. Again, and even though at that time the level of violence was a fraction of that in Iraq, I told Secretary Rumsfeld, Afghanistan is going to be the longest of the long wars. And obviously that turned out to be the case, but we could have continued. You know, we've had tens of thousands of troops on the Korean Peninsula. Yes, it's not active fighting the way we have had in Afghanistan, but again, we've sustained that. I think we have 40,000 troops on Japanese soil, again, depending on your counting rules and whether the aircraft carrier task force is imported or not, this kind of thing. We could have sustained that. Again, 2,500 troops, and by the way, and I predicted, I fear the psychological collapse of the Afghan security forces. Keep in mind that it wasn't just our withdrawal, but when we left, then all of the coalition countries left, and they actually were nearly triple what we had on the ground. Psychological effect on the Afghans is pretty profound. They see us leaving. But it was also the fact that we withdrew the 14,000 Western contractors who were needed to maintain the overly sophisticated aircraft that we had forced on Afghanistan. I refused, by the way, when I was still the commander. I said, we still want to get old Russian stuff. It's analog. They can repair it themselves. We get Black Hawk helicopters in here and all these jet turbines and everything. It's going to be very hard to maintain. And it was. We had to have 14,000 contractors on the ground. The minute we withdrew them, the operational readiness of the fleet went down, and that was the critical linchpin in a strategy that could only be this strategy, which is that you have a vast country, you have moderately trained and equipped police and military out securing the major population centers and critical infrastructure. When they get hit, the commandos, 35,000 strong, positioned around the country, very capable, very well trained, and so forth, they would go out and save the day. And so when we began the process of leaving, the Taliban did not control any of the major population centers at all. The erosion, there had been erosion of security, but again, it had not been that extensive. And you know, you ask people that lived in Kabul and the other major cities in particular, and their lot in life is absolutely horrific compared with what it was during the period that we were still there. So it's a decision that I questioned. I said, we will come to regret this decision. It was one that I essentially predicted on Fox News that, again, I fear the psychological collapse. And it is one that I hope we have learned. You know, our great colleague and friend, Ryan Crocker, the ambassador during the surge, he was your boss as the chief of mission. You were one of the other ambassadors. He had a saying, he used to say, you know, you can leave the movie theater, but the movie continues to roll. And this is our response. He and I we hated when we would hear our senior leaders saying, we have ended the war in Iraq, or we have ended the war in Afghanistan. We hadn't ended those wars. We had ended our participation in those wars, and that's a very different thing. In one case, the war continued. Iraq, you know, with moderate, again, their mistakes led to it, not ours. That was sustainable for them. Afghanistan, when we left, that war obviously took a disastrous turn. So I hope that we do learn from this. I hope that we learn that patience sometimes is required, especially if you can get to a situation that is, as I said, very sustainable. But look, before you say thanks, I want to thank you again for your 45 years of service, also for responding when Secretary Baker called and asked you to take on this position, for saying yes.
Oh, that was Secretary Blinken.
I'm sorry, oh, Secretary Blinken, okay, well, even better.
And Secretary Baker agreed.
Okay, and then thanks to all of you for supporting an institution that is very, very impressive and is named for an individual who is one of the heroes of our country. Thank you.
David, thank you very much.
All righty.
Thank you all.